Shlomo Melmed, Carolyn Meltzer,
Here.
Chris Miaskowski,
Present.
Shauna Stark, Carol Watson,
Here.
Keith Yamamoto.
Here.
Thank you very much. We have a quorum. Mark, back to you.
Great. JT, if you'd like to kick off with opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good morning, members of the Science Subcommittee and members of the public, and to our very hardworking team. The run of show for today's presentation, I'm, as Mark suggests, going to give some brief opening remarks. We're then going to proceed with Sham and Gil. Sham is pinch hitting for Rosa today, who's currently co-chairing a National Academies conference on precision medicine and neuroscience in Washington, D.C., and sends her best. But in the meantime, Sham is pinch hitting, and so it will be Sham and then Gil and then back to Sham for a wrap up, and then we'll be having discussion throughout. So that's kind of the order of things. So just by way of introduction, start out recognizing that everything we do, of course, including all the processes we're going to be discussing today for funding mechanisms, are, as always, in the constant quest to generate potential therapeutic treatments for our patients for currently incurable diseases. This process began back in late 23 when the board had a discussion about the fact that we had a finite amount of money remaining to deploy going forward for the life of the Prop 14 funds, and directed the team to undertake a prioritization process to determine where best to spend those dollars. That conversation was followed in fairly short order by a very dramatic increase in applications across the board on our various programs, which further emphasized the urgency of the prioritization process. So as you all will recall, we then implemented a pause over a period of months while we undertook an intensive data-driven analysis of where best to spend our funds going forward, which process ended up in September of 24 with the adoption by the board of the Strategic Allocation Framework, or SAF. That SAF included a number of impact goals to achieve various results, which in turn had a set of guiding principles which were adopted to direct funding towards the optimal grants as they would be reviewed over time in the various programs in our portfolio. To operationalize the guiding principles, the team developed and presented a set of preferences which were designed to emphasize certain elements of what we would be looking for in our programs going forward for the ensuing calendar year. When that was part of the adopted process by the board, we then proceeded with a rollout over time of a number of the concept plans, new and amended, throughout calendar 2025, with an eye towards seeing how the preference approach worked with respect to the various programs, and would come back in a year to discuss with the board the results of that and recommendations going forward for the following year. We, in that timeframe, got through 2 Clin 2 rounds, 2 PDEV rounds, and 1 Disc 4 round, and that gave us a set of data on how the preference approach was working. What we discovered was that that approach carried with it a number of unintended consequences, which were conveyed both by the board and by PIs and other stakeholders in the CIRM ecosystem to the team, and that we were instructed to integrate those concerns into our proposal for what we should do this coming year. And so that is resulted today in coming back to you with an approach which does not use the preferences any further and does instead use a new approach, integrating scientific review with the pre-selection process, which allows us to apply the guiding principles at that stage, as well as at the board once full GWG review has been done, and will help guide the board in its programmatic discussion on which grants to fund in any particular given round. You will hear on the program side from Sham much more on this. Gil will go over in great detail how the volume control approach to reducing the number of applications to a more manageable amount while still increasing those that go to the GWG and ultimately the board for full consideration in alignment with the guiding principles. And then Sham will come back to you with a discussion on how this will all play out at the ARS using this new approach. Wanted to say that the purpose of the new approach is to maintain focus on our goals, to be fully transparent with an eye towards increased fairness for all applicants, and to control the volume of the grants that are going through the system in a way that gives the board the opportunities to select those grants that will give patients the best chance for therapeutic treatments going forward. So that's an introduction here. I want to close by giving massive thanks to Rosa, Sham, Gil, and the teams for all of the extreme amount of heavy lifting they've done to get us to this point where we can have the discussion today, the preparation of the memo, the deck, the amended concept plans, everything that was agendized for your review in advance. So thank you all to the team for the extremely dedicated effort to make this happen. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sham.
Thank you, JT, for the introduction and for the obligatory baseball reference. I'm going to share the slide deck and then we'll get going with the presentation. Give me 1 second, please. So thank you to the Science Subcommittee for the opportunity to present to you today. As JT mentioned, we'll be going over several things over the course of the next 2 hours. I do want to first start off by acknowledging Rosa's leadership throughout this whole process, as well as the partnership from the executive team, Gil and the review team, as well as the programs colleagues, especially Dr. Joe Gold, Dr. Kelly Shepard, Dr. Sarah Taylor, and Dr. Liz Noblin, all of whom are on the Zoom with you today. So as we get going through this, as JT mentioned, I'll start off speaking about the preferences and guiding principles. Gil is going to go through the review process details, and then we'll come back around to programmatic recommendation considerations. So as JT noted, over the past few months, the board has provided extensive feedback, measured as well as critical, on aspects of the preferences and the preference-based evaluation processes. While the board definitely recognized that there is a need to have filtering and that CIRM cannot fund all projects, raised extremely valid concerns that the preferences were being used in a way that could potentially exclude classes and modalities or innovative projects, and that applications were ultimately being triaged without any scientific evaluation. The board also provided extensive feedback on guiding principles that may underlie each program and to make sure that those are appropriate for those programs and that they're tailored to those programs. And also, in addition to that, the board stressed the need to have transparency as well as stronger communication across any of priority areas and processes that are incorporated into each of our funding programs. And lastly, the board had several requests for data, particularly around the outcomes of the preference process, as well as a current active awards portfolio. All of that is in the memo, and it is not necessarily in this presentation. We're more than happy to walk through that. So over the course of this presentation, we'll be pausing several times to gauge board feedback, to get your feedback and approval and agreement on several elements as we go through this. So first of all, a recap of preferences. As JT mentioned, the preferences really flowed from underlying guiding principles for each of the three programs that we're going to be discussing today, DISC-4, PDEV, and CLIN2. And the intent was, how are these programs going to fund projects that ultimately respond to the appropriate impact goals, whether that be advancing therapies to late-stage clinical trials or resulting in the discovery of novel biomarkers and targets for diseases that affect humans. So in that sense, the preferences were intended to play two key roles, and those were to help us prioritize what we fund and to also be applied for volume control so that a manageable number of applications would go to grants working group review and ultimately to the board for approval. In doing both of these things, the CIRM team needed to make sure that the preferences were specific, transparent, and could be objectively applied. As we've all learned with respect to the board feedback, as well as the analysis that's in the memo, this amplified the limitations of this approach. So particularly that the preferences were applied prior to scientific review. And so the filtering for priority areas is happening before the benefit of the grants working group scientific review. And secondly, by their very nature, being so specific and directed, the preferences would require annual review of our portfolio by the board, as well as annual adjustments. Ultimately, we came to the conclusion, much like the board did, that this is not a sustainable process in the long run for building a portfolio that is going to be composed of impactful projects that ultimately help us achieve our impact goals. And so in extremely dramatic fashion, we are proposing to remove the point-based preferences, both as preferences themselves, as well as the point-based preference volume control measure that was introduced in the DISC-4, PDEV, and CLIN2 programs. Instead, the intent is to go back to the guiding principles, which were previewed a little bit in January, but we're actually going back to the program guiding principles and ensuring that the board has agreement on how those guiding principles can shape what we fund for each of those three programs, and also how we can apply those guiding principles at each step of the application life cycle. So throughout this presentation, we're going to be making reference to the steps that are on this slide. I'm going to take just a moment to describe those so that we're all familiar with the terminology that's being used here. So once an application is submitted, as JT mentioned, because of the fact that all of our programs are in very high demand, there is a need to implement a volume control step prior to those applications going to full scientific review. The volume control step focuses as well as reduces the number of applications to allow for meaningful scientific review for each of those three programs. The second step in the process is that once those applications have been forwarded to scientific review, the grants working group that's always been the case that they've reviewed and will continue to review those applications going forward, will conduct a scientific merit review of those applications and create a set of funding recommendations. Those funding recommendations from the scientific review are forwarded to the ARS of the ICOC, which incorporates the GWG recommendation, as well as any number of programmatic factors to make their funding decisions. So those are three steps that we'll be talking about throughout this process. And as we go forward, we are seeking two things from the board today. We are seeking your board feedback, as well as agreement on what we should fund for each of these three programs, DISC-4, PDEV, and CLIN2. Effectively, what are the guiding principles underlying these programs? And secondly, we're seeking board feedback on ensuring that the guiding principles are applied by the right party with the right information at the right time at those three critical steps of the application lifecycle. Along the way, I'm going to be pausing quite a bit to get board feedback on each of the guiding principles for each program, as well as on the process. So we're going to jump right into the guiding principles for PDEV and CLIN2. These are the programs that advance projects from discovery through all the preclinical studies to get to IND clearance, and then all stages of clinical trials. In setting up the guiding principles for this, just want to take a quick moment to give a quick overview of the current landscape of cell and gene therapies in particular. So as the board knows, there are about equal numbers of approved CAR T therapies, AAV gene therapies, and lentiviral modified HSC therapies. While the CAR T therapies are currently focusing on blood cancers, particularly CD19 and BCMA targeted therapies, the AAV and lentiviral HSC gene therapies have a slightly broader scope. They're targeting different disease areas and different genetic bases. Across the board, for the most part, all the therapies that have been approved to date have been shown to have significant impact on clinical outcomes for patients. At the same time, all of them have experienced challenges in patient access. When we look at the portfolio of preclinical and clinical therapies across the spectrum, not just CIRM, but globally, there are a lot of encouraging signs. There are quite a few different modalities in genetic therapies and cell therapies being targeted at all major disease areas. In the cancer space, you have allogeneic, autologous, and in vivo genetic therapies being targeted at solid and blood cancers and generating clinical data. On the in vivo side, all three of the current most advanced gene editing platforms, CRISPR, base editing, and prime editing, are all generating clinical data, and some have pretty strong clinical validation in different disease areas. Another encouraging sign is on the pluripotent stem cell derived therapies, where at the moment, there are advanced late-stage clinical trials for these therapies for Parkinson's disease, type 1 diabetes, epilepsy, and potentially even cardiac coming soon. That's very encouraging. 5 years ago, I don't think we would have thought that was even possible, where the shape was at that time. And so putting all of that into perspective, that's what shapes the guiding principles that you're going to see on this slide. And then I'll pause after that to get board feedback. I'm going to display all of them at once and walk through them, so please bear with me. So the guiding principles for the PDAP portfolio and the CLIN2 portfolio are very similar in scope, given what I just mentioned about the overall landscape of cell and gene therapies. So given the fact that the bar has been set pretty high so far, we think that overall, the PDAP portfolio and the CLIN2 portfolio should offer potential for therapies. The therapies that we fund in these portfolios should offer potential for transformative patient outcome. And on the PDAP side, they should be leveraging cutting-edge therapeutic technologies to serve that purpose of transforming patient outcomes. Across the portfolio, our projects that we fund should learn from the experiences of the first generation of cell and gene therapies to take meaningful, practical, and feasible steps toward addressing access and affordability barriers for those types of therapies. In alignment with our access and affordability toolkit and review processes and support mechanisms, this could range from aspects of the therapeutic approaches to planning at stage appropriate points along the development life cycle for access and affordability of those therapies, all of which in turn would help make sure that those therapies, if they were to be approved, are in a better position to be accessible for the patient population. And lastly, given the fact that at the moment, cell and gene therapies are being targeted at all manner of different diseases, our portfolio as a whole for both PDAP and CLIN2 should be broadly addressing both prevalent and rare diseases that affect Californians. So I'll take a break there to request board feedback on the guiding principles for both the PDAP program and the CLIN2 program. I'll turn it back over to you, Mark.
Okay, with that, if you guys can help me, if you see hands raised, because I may not be able to see them all from my screen. But first of all, let's start with any questions or comments with respect to what Sean has presented.
Carolyn Meltzer has her hand raised. And then
Okay, Carolyn. Okay,
Yeah, so
Carolyn, Pat, thank you.
So thank you, Sean. I like throwing at the point-based system. I think while we all intended it to be helpful. I think it's had some unintended consequences, as you've pointed out. And I like the idea of going through the portfolios now to figure how we enrich them with which types of grants. So anyway, just some sort of initial thoughts. I think this is great.
Great. Pat?
Yeah, so I think I've said this before. I'll just say it to the whole Science Subcommittee that I know that the access and affordability component is a component of grants going, and it was unclear. It's unclear to me how the GWG is using plans to address this, and I think that I have no issue with having access being judged in terms of the proposed research that's going to be done, like eventually access. I still struggle with research groups addressing affordability, since that is a challenging area that states and federal officials are struggling with. And to have investigators weigh in on that, I think takes time. And I still don't quite understand how they can address that in a meaningful way for the GWG to evaluate. So I'll stop there. But access, I believe they should and can address.
Thank you, Pat. Keith or Sean, do you want to respond to that comment, actually?
Certainly, yeah, I could do that. So thank you, Pat, for that great question. And you've raised an element of practicality and feasibility with respect to that topic. And so I'm going to address it for both of these programs. And so in the application, we have asked the applicant to define, their current understanding for their particular approach. What is the reimbursement and treatment landscape for those types of approaches, and what they plan to do in order to understand that better over the course of the award, and where they think they could be making meaningful improvements in that space. And so on the PDEV side, when the grants working group reviews that, the access and affordability component is part of the overall value proposition question that asks them to consider the overall impact of that therapy on the patient population, the unmet need, as well as whether the awardee understands and has is planning to address these barriers going forward in a meaningful way. But it's one component of the overall value proposition review process. On the CLIN 2 side, the access and affordability plan elements are baked into what the access and affordability reviewers look at. And so both on the CLIN 2 and the PDEV side, the planning part is not meant to be punitive. It's actually meant to be, what's your current state? How are you going to use CIRM funding to better your understanding of how these therapies are delivered to patients and how they're paid? And then what are meaningful stage appropriate steps that you're going to be taking over the course of the clinical development plan to make sure that when this therapy is closer to approval, that the market access, patient access elements are also coming along at the same rate. So that's sort of how we view this, in the sense that, does the applicant have a good understanding? If they don't, how do they plan to advance that understanding over the course of the CIRM award? And what are some steps that they could practically take at the moment that they've already defined that could make a difference here? So overall, we think that in this particular element for access and affordability, these could be value adds to an already impactful project that may be more attractive for the board going forward.
So with that, if I may drop in a comment, I think it is important around the terminology, because one indicates address, and an address is an okay term, but it sounds like for consideration, the term maybe assess in the application is more definitive about what the expectations are for evaluating the current landscape. And of course, if the proposed modality is having an direct impact, that's obviously added into the application. Is that perhaps a definitional item that might help clarify what is meant by addressing the barriers?
So I think, Mark, if I understand your question correctly, it's more about making sure that the reviewers are trained and guided on how to assess that particular question in their criteria. Is that appropriate to say?
Yeah, that first of all, that the applicants understand what is meant by addressing the known barriers, which is by and large what I functionally heard was an assessment process. And the second, that the reviewers understand the context of this. And, you know, on occasion, as we've discussed, sometimes some of the reviewers think it's a condition of, well, you're not addressing the underlying cost of this modality. And that's not necessarily at all what is meant by this bullet point. So therefore, there's you know, discussion and training and education for the reviewers.
Thank you for that feedback.
Okay, with that, why don't we go to Keith, I think was next, and then Judy had her hand up earlier.
Great.
We'll start with Keith.
Thanks, Mark. My comment is very similar to Pat's as usual. And I talked about this in the board meeting before, and that is a concern about, well, let me back up and say first that this criterion runs a big risk of disadvantaging new innovative technologies. New technologies at their beginning are never affordable because they have to be scaled. And so, you know, I use the obvious example of the human genome sequencing that cost $3 billion and took 10 years. And so that wouldn't have passed muster very well looking at affordability or access, since it was only one person sequence. But that's really true. That gate is really true of all novel technologies, all innovations. So I think it would be really unfortunate if this principle had the consequence, the definitely unintended consequence, of eliminating innovative new technologies that are brought forward. And there's really no way that the investigators could make a reasonable argument that their novel technology is affordable. And then talking a bit about what Mark said, you know, asking, and I guess Pat did this as well, that asking the investigators to anticipate how payers would respond to any new technology in terms of whether they're willing to reimburse or not, I think is not really appropriate. And so, you know, those are the two concerns I have about this second principle, is the effect it has on innovative approaches, because they are by necessity not affordable at the outset, and that asking researchers to try to anticipate the way that payers would respond to a new approach, I think is not appropriate.
Mark, can I respond to that? Mark,
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I think
Go ahead, Maria.
something that Sham, I think, was trying to explain. So it is not punitive for the applicants around these criteria of access and affordability. It is really meant to generate a conversation for them internally, as well as the life cycle of the award goes through, around activities that will benefit them when they're going for BLA, around it's not Are the insurers going to cover it? It is, have you started conversations with insurers to understand data that they might need in order to one day potentially reimburse this therapy? So it is definitely not everything has to be figured out and set by the time they're there. It is, have you started the appropriate activities that would lead this to one day perhaps be reimbursable and also accessible to more people? So I want to dispel any notion that this is somehow, it works against them. The only way this works against them is if they provide no information or look like they don't want to participate in activities around this. So I do think it's important for us as a funding organization to ask that this be something that is considered, that they work towards, because again, we want our therapies to be accessible and one day reimbursable to the people of California. So I hope that sort of explains a little more. And if we need more explanation to the applicants around what we mean, by all means, let's do it. And if that's what we're struggling with, then I think, Sham and teams can work towards that.
Yeah, Maria, I think that's important because I think this is the condition where I was trying to get to with respect to making an assessment, as opposed to saying that, okay, our technology is going to be low cost and be fully adopted by insurance. That's more, it's more creating a checklist for people to think about as they move forward in their clinical and PDEV applications. But let's continue with other comments.
But if I could just interrupt for a second.
Go ahead, Keith. Thanks, Keith. Go ahead.
I'm a little bit concerned about what I heard there is that there's an expectation for the applicants, the investigators, to have at least initiated negotiations with payers. Is that really what we are expecting or wanting at this stage?
At the CLIN stage? Because it depends on which stage you're talking about, Keith. And I can have, Sean can answer.
Well, it's in both PDEV and CLIN.
It's different. There are activities at different stages of the cycle. So for PDEV, the expectation is different than later stage clinical programs.
Yeah, I can highlight some of that if you'd like. So on the PDEV side, in the application, they'll often describe how their technology platform is meant to reduce things like manufacturing costs, or the use of reagents, or even some aspects of the delivery of those therapies in a clinical setting, where it could reduce costs based on the setting where those therapies are delivered, how they're delivered, and whether it's using existing practice or not. So we're seeing a little bit more of that sort of richer dialogue from the applicants in the proposals. And then with respect to the access and affordability planning that Maria is referring to, we've instituted planning goals across both programs and are making CIRM funding available for them to use that to make those goals. So on the PDEV side, the planning goals, they don't have to have anything done by when they apply, but over the course of the award, they can use CIRM funding to better understand what's the current treatment and reimbursement landscape for existing approaches in that disease area, as well as understanding what the pathway would be to get a therapy approved and commercialized. And so they're sort of doing the really early product development planning and can use CIRM funding for that. And that helps them be better prepared when they get to the clinic. On the clinical side, as Maria mentioned, there's stage appropriate planning activities that they would be doing. So for a phase 1 trial, they're building on the PDEV work where they're further refining their understanding of the treatment landscape, the reimbursement landscape, as well as building on that commercialization pathway, maybe thinking about manufacturing improvements and so on. But as they get closer to pivotal trials, that's where, as Maria noted, there should be more interaction with payers on understanding how payers think about these types of therapies, so that at that point, when they are approaching approval, that they're better prepared to be able to roll these therapies out quickly to patients.
Thanks.
And
Mark,
Do you
Mark,
think,
Chris
oh,
next.
yeah,
Mark, could I comment on this as well?
yeah, Chris, and then we'll get to Monica. Sorry, Monica.
I was going to comment on the same thing as
Okay,
well.
go ahead, Monica.
So really great discussion. Sorry to cut you off, but maybe I'll set up your comments even better. When I'm listening to this is a very important discussion, but there's two separate issues I just want to put on the table. First issue is we're talking about three very different, distinct criteria: scientific, innovation, technologies, clinical health impact, and access affordability. One's a business, very difficult on society, government, and lots of accessibilities to do it: clinical health impact and scientific innovation. Again, really two different expertise, but often combined in study sections and that can be done. When you look at these, you really have a situation which goes wrong in many funding foundations, NIH, and this. What program means, who can review, and listening to all this explanation that I'm hearing, because I read all the documents, really prepared for the meeting, and what I'm hearing wasn't strictly speaking in the documents. So an applicant, a reviewer, and a new group of people who is on the board will all come to different things here. And so this conversation is really important. I love all the criteria that are being stated, but trying to do all of them in sort of the same step. Is it that putting something, the second point on the table? So the first point is we have three things that are being sort of confounded, and you're asking for some stuff that's a moving target. That yes, you want to encourage activities, but the people who are going to be good at the scientific innovation and even understanding the clinical impact are not the business folks, nor some of these other folks that are going to do the access and all that. So, and how those are actually interpreted on the review is really needs to be articulated with really good examples in each of the different kinds of stages of these funding mechanisms. And I think that's problematic just listening to the discussion, but aspirational where we need to go. And the second one is not really for now, but when we're thinking about this and you're thinking about funding, are we trying to get good technology, clinical health impact? And then are we trying to do something like what I used to watch the MS Society do? Pair industries, the fast forward kinds of accounts where you pair people after it goes through the scientific things, you pair them or they come in with pairs of champions on industry that says, hey, we're going to help guide and advise. So I'm just putting that as a table, something for later discussions, but I think it illustrates this is something that's been considered by other therapeutics-oriented foundations that have had impact and have guided things. And I just think the way we're talking about is very good. It's aspirational, but devil's in the details here. Thank you. So hopefully, Chris, that helps you say whatever you're going to say.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. So my comments are primarily related to my service on the grants working group. And I believe that the access and affordability principle is exceedingly important. And I want to state that we may be misinterpreting the criteria. I think the applicant gets really specific guidance in the PDEV program and in the CLIN program about what to include in the application. And I can share from the many grants I've reviewed or observed being reviewed on the GWG, there's a range, just like in any other grant application, of responses. And we adjudicate those. Recently in the CLIN program, there have been experts on the GWG who can provide meaningful and rigorous comments about the applicant's appraisal of access and affordability. So I really want to ensure the members of the committee that this is rigorous and at the same time very, very fair. I don't think it's penalizing anybody. I guess the other comment I would make is, as I'm hearing the discussion, In our review of these applications, affordability does not equate with cheap. All right. We have had applications where the applicant has said, we've evaluated the landscape and this therapy is going to cost X, sometimes millions of dollars to treat a patient. And the argument is articulated very, very clearly about that. And nobody's saying, oh, it's cheap. The access issue, particularly for the CLIN program, really does require thought. And in adjudicating, can they recruit the patients? Are they looking at a broad area? Do they have the right people at the table to begin to bring patients, family members into the clinical trial? Anybody who's doing a CLIN application should have that. And sometimes we don't see it. And that's not okay. We can't judge whether that therapy is going to be evaluated in a randomized trial or a dose response study in a meaningful way. So I would support all of the principles that are listed here. And I do think the committee has to have some trust that the GWG has both the scientific rigor as well as individuals on the committee who can judge the access and affordability.
Thank you, Chris. Carolyn?
Yeah, so just building on what Chris said, and I don't see I'm not on a review committee, but I do think, there has to be a thought process as how it would be, large scale manufactured, how it could be accessible and affordable. Now, and I think I think you made this point, Chris, if it's a rare disease and it's never going to be, really affordable, it still may be important. If it's for solid tumors, and and it'll never be affordable, that's a different story, because of the prevalence issue. So I think of it as a balance as well, and just want to know that the reviewer is projecting, and then for the CLIN 2, it has to be more work certainly done in that space.
Let's do Chris follow up and then pick up with Pat.
Carolyn, I really appreciated your comment. And without divulging too many details, one of the applications we reviewed in the last cycle, the applicants had engaged with the insurance industry. And I think they did a really interesting analysis. It was a CLIN 2, and what I was struck by in that application is that they were initially going to test the therapy in individuals who had a specific disease entity. I'm not remembering all the details, but it would have been considered a rare disease. And they were projecting that this therapy would go from this rare disease implication to the broader population. What was fascinating to me, reviewing this for the first time, was the insurance companies said, we're okay with this product being initiated and tested in a rare disease, and it's going to cost X amount of money, and we'll be happy to consider it for reimbursement. However, when we get to the broader general population of old people for this therapy, we're going to reserve judgment. And for me, I really appreciated that that was a conversation CIRM started and hopefully will carry over to other therapies. And we have to, I think, appreciate and foster that kind of dialogue. It's going to be really, really important for these therapies.
Pat?
Yeah, so, Chris, when you made your first comments, you did something really important, at least from my perspective, is that you actually described access in the way that I think about access, and I've endorsed that being an important criterion, because that the investigators can directly address, because it matters for all the reasons that you said. I don't have to state them again. And so I think here when you say address barriers to access and affordability, it puts these two things together that actually require different activities in order to meet the mission and the vision of the organization. So just use clear language. Describe what it needs to be addressed in terms of access and describe what needs to be addressed in terms of affordability. I have full confidence in the GWG. I want to have the same full confidence that a potential applicant understands what the GWG is looking for. And so it's just a matter of sentences that get written in a different way that make it clear. Here's what we mean by your engagement in terms of access, and here's what we mean by your engagement in affordability. And it could be in a bullet. I'm not asking for all of the explanation to be in a bullet. These are guiding principles. But I do think that they are separate. And you described the separate activities that are going on. Right now, it basically looks like, what are the barriers for these things? And as an investigator, like some investigators may be able to do what you just described in terms of that example. Other investigators that I know who I've talked to, just given this language, how do you interpret this? Well, I don't have access to the legislature to talk about, Medicaid reimbursement and what the issues are there. But I can go to my CEO who is talking to them about it. So I do think emphasizing the different activities and what it actually what we want from the applicant is really critical. And then I think there won't be any confusion and everyone will be happy about what's getting endorsed. So some wordsmithing needs to occur.
But I think, Pat, from my experience with this, and maybe others can come in as well, I think the questions on the application are clear. They're not ambiguous. So maybe we need to look at them in more detail, but they are separate on the application and people respond.
Right, but these guiding principles are going to go out to in the calls for in the request for applications. These are the guiding principles. This is the language, and so maybe they dig
I see what
deeper and they'll get clarity. I think it's pretty straightforward to do some editing here on this one, and then we can move forward.
Mark, can I
Agreed.
make a quick comment?
Yeah, go ahead, Tom. Yeah, please. Thank you.
This is Gil. So one of the things I just want to clarify, that the guiding principles that we're presenting here are the highest level that apply to CIRM. So this is what CIRM does, not what we expect applicants to do. The guiding principles inform ultimately the review criteria. They inform the objectives of the programs that we have. And so the instructions will follow those. And so when it comes to access and affordability, we do have a pretty detailed spreadsheet that outlines very specifically access elements versus affordability elements. The applicants at different stages are expected to meet. And in many cases, as Sham pointed out, especially for the PDEP program, there's really no expectation going in. It's only as you get to the later stages. And when it comes to the grants working group members, all go through training sessions. We have, a lot of times one-on-ones with them to talk about the overall program, the review criteria, and so on. But we have reviewers that are not necessarily part of the grants working group that are access and affordability experts that help review specifically these documents and give us clues about what it is that the applicants can do to improve their program, and kind of just tell us what status they are at, with the goal of providing enough information that goes back to the applicant to CIRM, such that if there's an award, we know how to help them and provide additional guidance. So I just want to make sure that it's understood that there's definitely training, there's definitely a set of language and clear parameters for how to address this.
And to add one additional point to that, once the awards are approved, on the CLIN 2 side in particular, where there are these escalating sort of activities that need to be done, the CLIN 2 team will work with external experts, bring them in to advise the awardee on some of the feedback that's been provided and more practical steps they can take over the course of the CLIN 2 award to advance their programs in respect to planning for eventual access.
Yeah, I get all that, and I understand the review process. I haven't seen the questions. I'm looking at these two boxes in the context of what you're proposing to do is to use these criteria to make decisions about grants moving forward or not moving forward. Not about the review criteria, not about what happens after a decision is made about funding or not. I get all that, and there's going to be great guidance, et cetera, et cetera. But what we're addressing here today is the language here that is going to be used to determine whether, and you'll get to it, as whether an application is going to move forward or not. Not about anything else. Not about what happens when the review occurs. Not anything. So the content needs to of what's going to be reviewed needs to address these things. And I'm just asking for clarity around that, not to take it out, but to just make it clear and not wait until, oh, well, once we get it reviewed and they're going to get funded, then we're going to have more advice for them. That's great. I'm not criticizing that. I'm just talking about the process, which is what we're addressing here today, of how a decision is made by the GWG about something moving forward or not. And there's a huge sensitivity by investigators. And we have to address that in a really clear way, really clear. And so these words matter right now, because that's where they're going to be seeing. They're going to be seeing this, and then they'll get to the application. But they're going to want to know why or how my grant moves forward or not. And speaking as somebody who continues to apply for grants, this is really important, right? To be clear, and we don't want to deal with again the issues that have been raised publicly by investigators that pointed out some of the problems in the initial approach to controlling numbers. Everyone here and on the board agrees, and I think investigators understand that some mechanism has to occur. This is a great step. I'm just asking for some simple, clear language about what you want in bullet number 2. That's all.
That's really helpful, Pat. So, here, I think there's going to be layers as we go forward. So here we're just saying, if we're going to construct a portfolio for PDEV and CLIN 2, these are on the whole, the projects, should be addressing these things, right? And so if we're looking at the makeup of the entire portfolio, I think as we get later on, we're going to be talking about the selection criteria and the review criteria as well. And I think at that point, your input is really valuable as to how we can tighten up those criteria to make sure that it's clear to the applicant and to the reviewer. And all of that is going to be in the PA as well as the guiding principles, the selection criteria, the review criteria, as well as the selection process in terms of how everything is scored. But I agree with you, it's important to make sure that everybody has a common understanding of what we mean when we say these types of terms.
Chris?
Yeah.
Could I ask a different question? If we're done with the access and affordability, I have less problem with that.
Yeah, just real quick, Chris. I concur with Pat's statement that we need to do additional work with those particular bullet points, because the clarity at the top level will drive a lot of concern or anxiety if there's too many interpretations that can be applied to that. So, and also, I want to compliment the CIRM team, because I think the underlying steps with the matrix of decision points and how that's all laid out, the additional experts on GWG is a very, very competent review cycle. So just wanted to add those comments. So Chris, go ahead.
So, as you know, I have less disagreement with access and affordability. The first criteria I'm struggling with, as someone who reviews these grants and trying to think about this if I were an applicant submitting them, how we're thinking about what a transformative improvement is. And I'd love to hear some comment on that. I would acknowledge that it probably depends on the therapy that's being initiated, but could you comment on that, Sham, or others on the team?
Yes, so for both programs, the transformative improvement comes into the value proposition review criteria, and Gil can get into that a little bit more. But both in the application and the review criteria, what we're asking the applicant to do is describe, what is the current state of treatments, both that are approved and in development, for that particular indication. And then how is your therapy improving upon those in terms of clinical outcomes for those patients? And even in there's questions about unmet medical need, and they're also framed in the way of, there's an unmet medical need, how is your therapy addressing this unmet medical need in a meaningful way beyond what else is currently available to those patients? And so in that sense, it's going to be specific to that indication, but it's meant to be something that is not just an incremental improvement, but something that is really going to make a difference in that patient's life. And they have to be able to explain that with respect to what else is available to that patient now, or may be available to that patient in a clinical trial.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments, or feedback for the team? I don't see any hands raised. So with that, do we want to proceed to the next agenda item?
Thank you for your thorough and very well thoughtful feedback on both of these programs. We'll take into consideration and come back to you on that second bullet point. I think we can all agree that the patient access component is universal across both programs, so potentially clarifying that point may be the appropriate way to go.
Thank you, Sean.
So we're going to move on to the DIS4 program guiding principles, and I'm going to take a minute to describe this program. So as the board may recall, the DIS4 program evolved from the REMIND program, and the intent here is to foster multidisciplinary and innovative approaches to better understanding of the mechanisms behind human diseases, ultimately resulting in novel biomarkers or targets that could then downstream lead to better therapies. So the real focus is on multidisciplinary teams coming together and addressing, leveraging all the data they have available and can generate to better understand different disease mechanisms, and then to take that the next step to develop novel biomarkers and novel targets for those diseases. And so in that sense, the DIS4 guiding principles are meant to foster that. And so the DIS4 portfolio as a whole will create multidisciplinary research approaches that integrate diverse sources of evidence. They'll innovate through collaboration, network synergy, and data leverage. And what we mean by that is that not only is each award multidisciplinary in nature, but the DIS4 awardees can leverage commonalities between different projects and be able to combine their knowledge, combine their data and their resources to advance the field as a whole. And lastly, that the DIS4 portfolio will implement Neuro Task Force and other organizational priorities. So as you may recall, the DIS4 program has a clear focus area. And so in this intent, the portfolio should be responsive to those focus areas as they evolve on an annual basis. And I'll pause there for board feedback on the DISC4 guiding principles.
Okay, if you could see hands for me, that would be great. Call out the hand.
Yeah, Maria's hand is raised.
Sean,
Maria?
you, Sean, so you're suggesting that this program, which I believe this is what we did last time, would be focused on one general area. And then are you asking the board or the science subcommittee and then the board to every year or when this program would come up, the focus area would come to the science subcommittee and then the board, and that's what we would agree. And we would narrowly focus this. So this would not be open generally. This would be the program where we focused in specifically on one modality or whatever it might be. Is that correct?
I'm going to take that question in multiple points. So first of all,
Multiple?
that was a great question, and I should provide a little bit more context there. So toward the end of this presentation, we will be asking the board to provide feedback and agreement on the next focus area. So right now, the way this program is implemented is that there is a focus area, but it's not exclusive. And so in that sense, the first round of the DIS4 program had a focus area of neurological disorders. And so that was the focus area, but it was not exclusive to accepting applications that only addressed that particular disease area. Others could have submitted. By and large, most of the applications that came in were neuro, and all the ones that there's going to be, I'm not going to say anything more because that program is under current review. But most of what we got was in the neuro area. I think it's in the memo. So today, what we're requesting from the board later on in this presentation is to update the focus area for the next round. However, at this point, we are not asking the board to make it exclusive, but if that is something the board would like to consider, we're open to that discussion. And Dr. Kelly Shepard, who manages this program, is on the line as well.
But it is the team's feeling that if it was exclusive, the program works better because the data that's generated is amongst the same types of projects. And so therefore the learnings are stronger. Is that right?
That's correct. And it may also provide more clarity to the applicant as to what it means to have a focus area for that program.
Okay, great. So then when this comes up later, I think that's definitely something we should consider. So thank you.
I don't see
Other hands? Okay, great. Okay, let's go on to the next agenda item. I think it's probably Gil.
Thank you. And so we're going to switch gears a little bit now to focus on ensuring that guiding principles are applied by the right party with the right information at the right time. And this is a lot of what Pat was talking about, which is how do we take these guiding principles and make sure that at every step of the process, they're rightfully applied with the appropriate information at hand. And so to tee up the rest of this discussion, I'm going to go through what our current proposal is at each step, and then Gil is going to get into the details. So first of all, the responsible party. So for each step, volume control, merit review, and funding decision, we're laying out who the appropriate party would be. And in red, we're indicating what has changed from the current approach. So for volume control, as we noted, we propose to have this be handled by the grants working group. Currently, as you know, is handled by the CIRM team with the preference-based approach. So here, the responsible party will be the grants working group making the selections. For merit review, it has always been and will always be the grants working group's prerogative to make recommendations based on scientific understanding of those applications. And then lastly, for the funding decision, it has always been and will always be the ARS's prerogative to make funding decisions on applications in any given cycle. So the next step of that is how are guiding principles being applied? And they're being applied to the criteria or the factors that are going to be included in each of these steps. So for the volume control, at the moment we had preferences. We would replace those with specific selection criteria the grants working group would be evaluating in making selections for applications that would move on to scientific merit review. And Gil is going to detail the selection criteria for each of the 3 programs in later slides. At the merit review stage, there are existing review criteria for each of the programs that were based on existing guiding principles, and those would largely remain unchanged based on the board feedback to date. And lastly, on the funding decision side, there are several programmatic factors that the board considers. We'll get into those later on in this presentation, but not necessarily adding or taking away any of those factors at this point in this process. And lastly, we're addressing the point about the right information. This is where CIRM's team role is to support each of these processes by building the appropriate processes themselves, by defining the selection criteria, and providing the appropriate level of information to each party to make any selections, recommendations, or decisions. So to give you an example on the volume control side is to define those selection criteria, the GWG composition, as well as the process itself in terms of the assignments, the scoring, and the feedback. Switching then over to the funding decision side, our proposal is to provide a more structured information package to the board to inform your decision-making in approving those awards. And so this would include, as it always does, the grants working group recommendation, but adding a couple more items as to how each of those applications is responsive to the guiding principles, as well as a more structured approach to our own CIRM team funding recommendation. And I'll get back to those points after Gil's presentation. So at this point, we're going to transition to Gil to walk through the processes, particularly for volume control.
All right, thank you, Sham. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So as Sham indicated, the volume control step is something that is very important, and over time, and particularly now with the increase in overall demand with our applications, it's a necessary step in our process. And in the past, we have used different mechanisms. We've used a pre-application process. We've even limited the total number of applications that could be submitted by a given institution. And then obviously, we've also tried the preferences. All have had, some benefits to them and been effective in narrowing a pool. But there are consequences to each that I think are important to consider and to learn from. And so what we're going to talk about is what we're proposing to do with volume control moving forward that we think address a lot of the concerns and some of the elements that we thought were lacking in the preference approach. So the goal, of course, is to narrow the pool. And ultimately, what we want to do with whatever method we choose is to remove what clearly has no merit among a pool of applications, to enrich them for those that are best aligned with our goals, and to have a more rigorous review of those that are most competitive. Next slide, please. So I want to show you this table to give you a sense of the extent of the volume control that we need across each of the different programs. Now, this is sort of intended to be a little bit of a comparator, so everything is based on if all of these would require a full application. But as you'll note later, for the DISC 4, we won't be asking for that. But just to give you a sense, so there's the target for merit review. That's what we believe is the most appropriate for a rigorous quality review for each of these programs. So they can range from up to 10 to about 50, depending on the program. And then in the third row is the number of awards that we expect to issue per cycle. So those that reviewed lead you to about this many that we would want to target. Oftentimes, even with these numbers, we end up with more recommended than we can fund for many of these programs. And then the last row is just the cycles per year that we have. And one important note as it relates to this table is that if demand changes for any of these programs, I mean, that can help adjust. If it were to lower, then we can do something different in terms of volume control. But if it increases, we still can only fund so many applications per cycle or per year, depending on how we've laid that out in the budget. So next slide, please. So the goals of our proposed process was to refocus the selection of applications on the science rather than on strict preferences for all the reasons that we've already noted. We ideally would want to align the programs with a more consistent volume control process across the different programs, because this would certainly help with applicants better understanding what's happening for us to communicate and use it to apply with minimal variability. And with what we want to propose, we can also leverage the longstanding learnings we've had from our positive selection process that was implemented since 2015 to continue to make improvements. And I'll tell you about how we believe we can improve it quite a bit in the new proposed method. We also were looking to increase efficiency and the opportunity to learn and implement improvements across the programs if they are more uniform. Next slide. So this is a table that shows what our current volume control processes are across these 4 programs of DISC 5, DISC 4, PDEV, and CLIN 2. And as you'll notice, we have very different approaches. We have, in one case, positive selection, in a couple of them, a pre-submission process where the preferences were applied by CIRM staff, and then CLIN 2, which is a modification of that, which we call a qualification process, that also makes use of preferences. The variability is also in who is making these selections. So for DISC 5, for example, you see that it's the grants working group through the positive selection process. In others, it is the CIRM staff or a combination of CIRM and grants working group. So quite a bit of variability in terms of what is done, as well as with the basis for selection. Next slide. And this is what we propose and what I will give you more details about as we move forward. We propose to have a process, a more unified process that we refer to as grants working group selection. It is based on the existing positive selection, but it has important differences. The submission in terms of what we would expect from the applicants coming in is in most cases a full application. And for DISC 4, we are requesting a pre-submission form or a short form application. The selection in all cases is consistent. It's all by grants working group. And the basis for selection for all of these is scientific value. So again, to reiterate, focusing on science, making it more consistent and more efficient as we move forward. Next slide, please. And so just a warning, these next 3 slides are slides that were added into the deck. So those weren't posted, but we will post these following this meeting. We added these slides just to help us in terms of presentation clarity. So we have moving forward, what we believe is a more unified grants working group selection process. I will talk to you about these elements that are bulleted. The process establishes a target number of applications for full panel discussion for each program. It specifies what would be the optimal and fixed number of reviews that occur per application, the number of applications reviewed by each reviewer, and the total number of reviewers that participate in each. Grants working group members under this process evaluate applications based again on scientific value that's described in the respective program announcement and that align with guiding principles. And we'll go over that. And then applications receive a composite score that includes ranking as one of the measures, and I will go over that. And advancement of those applications is determined by the composite score with a cutoff made at a natural break nearest the target. There is the addition of having more applications with a limit of up to 3. that can be advanced by the CIRM president. Right, next slide. Okay, so this table highlights some of the differences via example of the effect of different numbers of applications that can come in an application pool, and how we can manipulate the number of applications per reviewer, the number of reviews per application, in order to get the total number of reviews that we need for that given cycle, and that help us target for advancement the appropriate number of applications. So in these set of examples, we have an application pool that for DISC 5 on one extreme is about 200 applications. For CLIN 2 on the other extreme is only about 20. The total number of reviewers that would participate in this, we're just holding steady for the sake of this example at 20. Applications for reviewers based on that, meaning that's the size of the batch that each reviewer would look through and would review specifically, in order to determine what they feel are the most meritorious based on the criteria that we will discuss. So for DISC 5, each reviewer may be looking at about 30 applications, whereas at CLIN 2, they may only be looking at 5 in order to get the appropriate coverage. But given the number of applications, that means that the number of reviews per application with a very large number is often going to be a little less. So maybe 3 reviews per application at the DISC 5 stage, where we can more easily do about 5 per application at the CLIN 2 stage. And I'll note that these we consider to be minimums, meaning that we can adjust these numbers so that the number of reviews per application, even at DISC 5, could increase to 4. But we would make it so that it's fixed, meaning every application would either get 3 or 4, depending on the parameters.
Hey, Gil,
Yes.
Maria has her.
Oh, I'm sorry, Maria, go ahead.
That's okay. That's okay. How are you? I just noticed it says 20 reviewers, but there are 15 scientific and 7 patient advocates. So that already is more than 20. So what's the patient advocate responsibility? How are you factoring that in?
Right, so for this step, and same as what we've done with positive selection, we've used members of the grants working group, but we haven't limited to 15 because they're not acting as a panel. They are acting individually, looking at batches of applications, rather than as a single scoring voting panel that we typically have. And so, this
Sorry, I didn't understand that. I didn't understand that. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm not sure how else to explain. I mean, we don't.
Well, right now, for example, I was asked to go in to positive selection and choose some applications. So it asked me as a panelist to choose some as part of the GWG review. I'm sure Chris got the email, et cetera. So I'm wondering, how does that factor into the total number of reviewers? Is it an equivalence? Is it different? How is that determined?
Right, so the number of reviewers is determined by what allows us to have sufficient reviewers to get sufficient coverage and overlap of applications for the equivalent batch size for all reviewers. And so, these can be optimized in order to achieve that number. And so 20 in this example is a number that helps balance the coverage that we can get, while at the same time ensuring that each application, the batch that a group has is as representative of the larger pool as possible. But, you know, to your question of how do we exceed the 15, this is something that we explored with legal in terms of being able to do this at this stage. We've done it for the positive selection process a few times. We've increased the number so that we could have more expertise brought to the table and looking at applications at this stage. And so this represents the number of scientific reviewers. Now, the patient advocate members, as you mentioned,
That's what I meant. Sorry. I know this represents the scientific members. That was my specific question is, how does this affect the patient advocates?
Yeah, right. So the patient advocate members under the positive selection process functioned in many ways just like the grants working group reviewers. They were asked to pick any application, and if they picked it, the application advanced. We're moving away from that model. And so in this instance, the patient advocates are not part of this calculation. This is only the scientific members. You know, how the patient advocate members come into this step is something that still needs to be considered. We'd like to overlay it on this rather than it be the same thing. In other words, rather than assigning a patient advocate member a batch of, say, 30 applications, to have the same assignment as the scientific members may not be appropriate. So that is something that we want to continue to discuss.
Thank you.
All right, next slide, please.
Gil?
Yes.
This is Vito. Before you move on, I just want to look at that chart from a different perspective, a statistical perspective. Many of our board members and all of our principal investigators live in a world of Gaussian distributions, and they're concerned about probabilities, the power of sample populations, precision, predictive value, the whole. So I'm very comfortable if this number was just arrived at 20 reviewers, each doing 30 applications, coming up with a sample with a pot that you're going to work with of 600. But have you tried any statistical application that might lend some authority to that?
Yes. So one of the things that we have been doing is running simulations of different models and approaches. So one of the things I was going to mention in discussing the composite score and the flow chart that I'm going to show you in a minute is that we've run simulations using different methods, and a method that uses both selection and rank performs better than others. Because it provides the best cutoff clarity among all the different ones that we tested. The method also is very good at correctly advancing applications that we would expect to score 85 or above. And so this is based on data that we have from existing applications or the history of applications that we've had. So the catch rate, if you will, depending on the volume, with the highest volumes being the ones that provide the least certainty, it'll range from 77 to 100% using this approach. In terms of its ability to remove non-competitive applications, it ranges from about 73 to 99%. And so that is looking at, ranges that cover in the several hundred down to about the 20 that you see in Clin 2. So in comparing these, yes, there are advantages to that we've been exploring using real data, and also just statistically looking at and matching up what the appropriate batch amounts would be per reviewer, and what happens if you either increase the number of reviewers or decrease the number of reviewers. One of the things that we learned, we assumed sometimes that by increasing the number of reviewers, that would always be better, but that's not actually the case, because one of the things that happens is if you have too many reviewers, you know, you may benefit from having a lot of different expertise, but then the sampling from the larger pool is much less per reviewer. So they have less of a sense of the overall pool than a smaller number would. And so it's trying to balance these different elements to give you what may be, if you will, a sweet spot for each of these different programs, depending on the expected pools that you would have for that program.
Mark has his hand raised.
Oh, Mark.
Hey, Gil. As a patient advocate, I've seen in many cases the patient advocates provide an incredibly unique vantage point around applications from a perspective that others might miss. So, and historically, obviously, they've been part of the positive selection process, but I'd like to understand a little bit more about why patient advocates' role in this context are removed and why that's necessary as part of this process.
Right. So the part of the process, and I'm trying to remember if I have a slide on it, I think later, but I can tell you now, part of the process involves doing expertise match assignments with applications. So all of the reviewers noted in this layout are going to have the batch of applications generally matched to that expertise. And so that is in part what removes the patient advocate members from it. On the other hand, as you noted, there is great value in having patient advocate perspective. So what we want to propose is that rather than include patient advocates in the straight up expertise match, that we have a different layer of patient advocate involvement at this step. But at this time, I don't have a clear solution for.
Okay. Yeah, I think we need to address this because related to expertise, for example, you know, there are people who have long histories with, you know, the Parkinson's group or ALS or type 1 diabetes in my case and things like that. And I think it's important because they can, in fact, bring a different kind of expertise, if you will, or perspective that I think is inherent for why even a patient advocate role was created to begin with. So I just want to make sure that we noodle through this and make sure we understand exactly what the cycle is, who's involved, and if there is a change, be able to explain to people why they're no longer part of the process.
Right. Okay. That makes sense, Mark. Thank you. Are there any other?
Yeah, Gil, I'm confused, so I need you to help me out here. I was going to raise this later, but it's actually easy to do in the context of this figure. So my understanding of volume control in the previous system, the preference checkbox system, was to limit the volume of grant applications that were reviewed. We saw the problems with that, but I think that was the goal.
Right.
And here, it looks like everything gets reviewed, and the volume control is in terms of the number of applications that will go forward for discussion by the GWG. So do I have that right? And if so, is that the appropriate place for volume control to be exerted? One could argue, and I think we have argued previously, that it's important to have some kind of control on the number of applications that are reviewed, because as that number gets gets out of control, then the quality of the reviews gets or is at least threatened, if not eroded, because of just exhaustion of the reviewers. You're asking a lot of them, but what I'm seeing in this approach is that everything that comes in will be reviewed. And then there will be volume control exerted at the level of the number of reviewed applications that are then discussed by GWG. So do I have that right? And is there have those very important differences between the two approaches been discussed?
Right. So it's a little different than what you describe, in the sense that every application doesn't get a full review. So this is more analogous to our positive selection process, where what each reviewer receives is a batch of applications. So in an example of, say, 30, and they are asked to select the 5 that they feel are the most meritorious, right? But based on a limited criterion. So, and I will go over what that is. So it's not the full set of criteria that they would do in a full review. This is the high level scientific value of this proposal, equivalent to significance impact, if you will, of a set of criteria. So they select based on that, and they select their 5 best out of, say, the batch of 30,
Right.
and then they rank them. And so they rank each of those 1 through 5. And so when we say reviews per application, we mean that each application is going to get 3 reviews from 3 different reviewers. It's going to be in 3 different batches. So it has 3 opportunities in that example to be selected to advance. And if it's selected to advance, if it meets the cutoff, then it goes to a full panel review, which means then we assign specific experts in that application, and we design the panel around the applications that are selected to have a full, robust discussion of each of the applications that advance, do our typical 1 to 100 scoring, full critique of those applications, and provide, a full summary back to applicants. And so that's the distinction between those two steps.
And Keith, if I may just add a clarification. So Gil, he's describing the volume control step here. So this is still the volume control step and not necessarily a 2-step merit review yet.
Correct.
So I guess for me, then a lot would depend on what are the criteria that are used in this initial review. I don't know what else to call it other than review, but in this initial step, that differs from reviewing so the applicants, I'm sorry, the reviewers get the full application, but then they're asked to examine a smaller number of things rather than doing a full review. Do I have that right? And then what are those criteria?
It depends on the program. So for DISC 4, we're not asking for a full application. For PDEV
Right.
2 and DISC 5, we are. The DISC 5 is relatively speaking, a shorter application. And the volume is so high. I mean, for these types of programs, we easily got over 300 in the DISC 0, which was previous version of DISC 5. So
Yep.
and that was with full application. So the volume is extremely high there. For the PDEV in CLIN 2, one of the very important things there is the readiness element and ensuring that these programs can advance quickly. And so for that, the full application actually is quite important for us in order to understand that these programs are ready and at the appropriate stage to advance. But as mentioned for the DISC 4, we are, I think because of the way that's structured, we can allow a less than full application at that stage. The consequence though is that you end up with a much longer review cycle because you have to go through this process of determining which ones ultimately are selected to have a full application, and you have to give at least a couple of months for that application to be completed by the applicants before then you can proceed. So it does extend the life cycle.
Okay, so I can understand for the situations in which there's not a full application, but what I'm not understanding is that in the mechanisms in which full applications are submitted, what's the difference in what the reviewers are asked to look at and evaluate in this initial volume control mode compared to what happens in the full review? I mean, they're sitting with the same application, but they're treating them differently or approaching them differently or looking at different elements of them.
So
what's the difference?
we'll go over that.
Oh,
So
okay.
I have the slides for each program in terms of the
Okay,
criteria that we'll utilize. Other questions? No, good. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is an example. So as I mentioned, the methodology that we are proposing is one that utilizes two different measures. One is selection and the other is ranking. So the selection is measuring the breadth of interest across reviewers, and the rank helps measure the intensity of that interest. You know, how well do they like it if they do? And so we'll go through an example here of then how we bring those together to create a composite score for each of these. And so we're going to use PDEV in terms of the selection and scoring. So in this case, we have each application is assigned to 4 different reviewers. So that is present in the batch of 4 different reviewers. Each reviewer is assigned 15 applications and selects and ranks their top 5. So then those selections and ranks are converted into a composite score. And so in this table, you see the 4 different reviewers noted as GWG reviewer 1, 2, 3, and 4. In terms of selections, reviewers 1, 2, and 4 selected this example application, and so therefore it receives a point for each of those selections. And so we then calculate the points per maximum, meaning this application received 3 selections out of 4 possible. And then it's weighted 60%. So 60% times 3 out of 4, and I'll tell you why the weighting in just a second. The ranking, we take the ranks. So reviewer 1 in this example ranked this application as their top one. This is their number 1, so it gets 5 points. The second reviewer ranked this as their second favorite, and so it gets 4 points. The third reviewer did not select it, so therefore it doesn't get ranked. And the fourth reviewer also ranked it as their top application. And so the rankings of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are converted to points as noted, with the top one being 5 down to the 5th rank being a 1. So it kind of is inverse. And so the application receives 14 out of 20 possible points. And then that is multiplied by a 40% weighting. And so the weighting of 60 to 40% prioritizes the selection or breadth of interest by 60% over the very specific ranking, which we weight at 40%. So working out the math on that gives you a example composite score of 0.73 for this application. The best possible score, if this was selected by everyone and they all ranked it number 1, would be a composite score of 1. So that would be the best possible score. The composite allows us to do this weighting so that we can prioritize the selection while still benefiting from the information provided in the rank, and doesn't allow the ranking to outweigh other elements. So this is what the modeling in terms of the suggested balance provides for. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so now looking back at the overall process again. Oh, sorry, Pat.
So, sorry, Gil, if you go back one slide, I just have a question. So you have 3 out of 4 say move forward, and then they rank them, and you have 2 5s and a 4, so quite high rankings.
Right.
Does the one reviewer who say no and therefore 0 have a what's the right words, and a higher impact on whether this grant is going to move forward or not? Because if you have 3 out of 4, 3 out of 4 rank it either first or second in their pile. You have one that says no, and now your composite score is 0.73.
Right.
And I don't know if you figured out whether a 0.73 would allow this grant to get put forth or not. I'm just wondering whether one dissenter would have an overly negative impact on the grant moving forward or not.
Right. So, given the overlap and the variability in the batches, it is unlikely from at least the data that we have, because it's unusual for an application to have a very large number of selections, or where everyone selects it. So something like this I would view as one that is likely to advance and do very well. And it's even possible that one that receives a single selection and ranks very well in that reviewer has the possibility to advance.
Okay, just something to keep in mind in terms of whether the reality is that one dissenter can have a more weighted impact on whether grant moves forward or not. As you say, it's hard to know until you know what the mix is going to be, right? In terms of the okay, thanks.
But if I could just jump in here, Gil. So you just said that it's possible that one application that is selected but ranked very high could still have the possibility of advancing. So that would be 1 point on the selection side and 5 points on the rank side. It seems that would end up with a composite score that's pretty low.
Right.
I'm not sure how, it seems like the composite score loses a lot of information. You know, because you just said that only one review, and here we have a situation where only one reviewer even picks it out. That one reviewer happens to like it a lot, but the others didn't even select it. So, but you've just told us that that would still have a chance to be supported.
Well,
When you could do the same kind of math to say that large number of reviewers, let's say 3, select it, and they all give it sort of a mediocre rank. And so I'm just concerned that by making this composite score, you're losing that kind of enthusiasm level of evaluation. And how much does composite score really mean? And if that's the criterion by which things move forward or not, is this the right way to be doing this calculation?
right. So the composite score that you get is going to be a relative number based on the selections made by
Sure.
the reviewers. So, you know, ultimately we don't know where the cutoff is going to be, but the modeling of it suggests that it you know, cutoffs can be very clear using this method, meaning it can distinguish those applications that are going to be favored by reviewers versus those that are not. Where, you know, it ends up being, whether it requires at least 2 selections, 1 selection to advance a particular set of applications, you know, we need to maybe model that itself, and that may actually be in data we have where I can maybe give you a better answer. I just don't have it. But you know, it also will depend on what we ultimately get. Now, the weighting is important here as well, because as you said, you know, the level of enthusiasm is important, but you know, an application that's selected multiple times by more reviewers suggests that it represents something that interests, you know, multiple reviewers. But the rank, you know, by a given reviewer, if they rank it high, it is, you know, still reflecting that enthusiasm. If they are more mediocre in terms of the rank, then, you know, then the likelihood of advancing may be lower. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of scenarios that we can play around with and understand more. But in terms of how we've compared it to other methodologies, this continues to be the more robust in doing important things. One, giving us a clear cutoff, predicting which applications that demonstrate good quality, again, using real data from what we've done in the past, those that are likely to score 85 or above, meaning they would be recommended by the grants working group, and removing those applications that are not likely to be competitive. And so, you know, with a large number of proposals, this is, you know, at least a confidence of 77 to 80%, up to 99 and 100% confidence using this methodology.
Hmm.
All right.
I think I have to think about this a little more, but okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this is reviewing kind of the different steps along the selection process. So again, here illustrating it through example, if you have a pool of 200 applications, we take that pool and make assignments to a set number of reviewers. And so let's say 20 reviewers that will then each get a batch of 30 applications. the grants working group proceeds with making selections and ranking those selections so that we can derive composite scores. The composite scores should allow us to see a natural break between those that score well and those that don't, and that align around our target. If we do not see that, there are a couple of ways in which we can tie break if it's necessary. So we can use the higher nomination count as one step. If that doesn't work, those that receive the higher rankings or a top ranking can be used to break a tie. And if that doesn't work, then we, as indicated in this diagram, resort to a second round of selection with that group that cannot be discerned. And so until we then get a clear separation. So for those that advance, so the top 40 to 50 with clear separation would go to then the full merit review. And so that means that we would make full assignments, expect a critique, and they would be discussed by the panel as we typically do with the grants working group. Those that don't make it, the CIRM team and president can review those, and the president can make selections to advance a limited number up to 3. And the basis for that selection would still be aligned with the guiding principles that I will show you in the subsequent slides. For anything that the president believes might have been missed or that we see as having a good alignment and promising project along those principles. And so the president has that option. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to go through these one at a time, starting with CLIN 2. You have seen the guiding principles, so these are just reiterating what Sham showed you in terms of the transformative impact for patients, addressing barriers for access, affordability, and so on. And then below that, you see the criteria for the grants working group selection, which we collectively term the scientific value. So what these elements represent, these first 3 bullets: impact of the proposed treatment for patients if successfully developed, the significance of the unmet need, practicality and feasibility of the proposed treatment to be adopted by patients and healthcare providers, are the exact same as in the full review criteria that the grants working group uses for their scientific evaluation. But here we're focusing the reviewers on the overall value. Is this something that is worth further consideration because it has the promise of actually having a transformative impact? And the other important element, particularly for the CLIN applications, is the stage readiness of this project to advance and successfully complete a clinical trial. So that would be the focus in the ask of the grants working group reviewers at this volume control stage of review. They would expand to the other elements, and I'll show you that in a subsequent slide, of the full criteria for the full review if they do advance. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the same thing, showing you the guiding principles now for the PDEV program that were presented by Sham, and then how they inform then the scientific value. And once again, these bullet points that show the potential to provide a meaningful and substantial improvement in clinical outcomes, impact of addressing unmet medical need, potential for more accessible, affordable compared to available treatments, and feasibility and practicality of the therapies uptake by patients, caregivers, and healthcare system are the exact same bullets that exist under the first value criterion that the reviewers have. And in the same way, again, focused on that element for this stage of the review. Oh, Pat.
Yes, so Gil, this is where my disconnect is again, and I don't want to re-prosecute the issue around affordability, but the therapies potentially be more accessible and affordable compared to available treatments or therapeutics currently in clinical development is not what my interpretation of the discussion was, in which there would be a plan for how the investigators would engage in understanding what the challenges are in terms of affordability, et cetera. This to me, when I read this as an investigator, says I need to demonstrate in my application how what I'm proposing is going to be more affordable than what the current treatments are for a particular disease or disorder. Not a plan of how I'm going to engage once I get the application, but rather real proposal about how this is going to be cheaper, less expensive. And so we can go round and round on this, but the conversation we had and this as a criterion are not the same.
Yeah, yes. So we have not incorporated the discussion into this. This represents what's in the current review criteria and program announcement. But I think the discussion that we've had, I think, informs what we would put in the new program announcement. I think incorporating the comments that you provided. So definitely recognize that.
And Pat, to that point, that's a wonderful point that you're raising and completely appropriate. And this is where in the PDEV applications and the reviews particularly, the affordability element in this instance really sort of focuses on, manufacturing, the route of administration and those sorts of things, rather than sort of the affordability that you're hinting at, which is this aspect of, is a payer going to pay for it kind of thing.
Okay, well, I mean, my conclusion is the conversations were long and complicated.
Yeah.
Those of us who are on the board are interpreting it in overlapping but not identical ways. And the one thing we want to take out of this to bring to the full board is some clarity and transparency about what the team means by this and what the investigators are expected to achieve in their application. That's my feeling. Whatever that is, it's a longer conversation.
Yeah.
Monica has her hand raised.
I just want to double down on Pat's comment because it just recaptures what the things I was trying to bring up, acknowledging all the wisdom of the GWG. That's not the issue explicitly. It's that as somebody who submits grants all the time, you pore over this, you try to do this, and then just listening to how all we heard it as the GWG evolves, over time, members change, all of this kinds of stuff. These are the things that get lost. And we all like the principles. We all are agreeing on that. But I keep saying the devil's in the details. And this is not just something simply to say we're going to wordsmith it out. This really needs to be focused, grouped, and really worked out in details, because it is public facing. It is something we have to be sensitive to. It's clearly quite readily misunderstood by very intelligent people coming from all these different things. And yet we all agree on the aspirational goals. So just want to double down on that comment.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, we can, I think, go to the next slide then. All right, and so then this is the same thing for DISC 4. noting again the guiding principles above and then how they inform the overall scientific value. In this case, for DISC 4, we're looking at the impact of the proposed project in advancing understanding of human disease, generating data resources, or where outcomes rapidly advance a therapeutic or a biomarker. But we're also introducing the element of innovation relative to the current state of research, such as applying novel frameworks to study disease, cutting across silos, employing a unique synergy of technologies, or utilizing innovative approaches. And of course, the responsiveness of the application to the focus area that we decide on would also be an element that would be considered in the overall scientific value of the proposals at this stage. Okay, next slide. Okay, and so for those applications that advance, so the narrow pool, they are evaluated, scored by the full panel as mentioned. And the evaluations and scores are then now based on the full set of review criteria, and those specific review criteria are detailed in the memo. They're a bit more extensive than would fit for each program on this slide, and they also vary a bit for each program because they're tailored to each of the different funding opportunities. But in general, they cover these elements: the overall value proposition and or significance and impact, which is essentially what the focus of the volume control element is, but they continue to consider that as they move forward into the full review. Innovation applies to the DISC 4 only. And then the others are rationale of their proposal, the project plan and how they've designed it, the project team and the resources available to the project, and population impact. Population impact refers to the impact of addressing this disease on the population that is affected. And so that for a clinical trial application, for example, can include understanding the affected population that exists. This is particularly important for certain rare diseases, understanding the types of patients, number of patients that are affected. Also what they have done as applicants to understand that population and how they will enroll, do outreach activities to bring that broader population into a trial. At the discovery stage, it is simply understanding how differences that might impact outcomes, such as sex differences or other elements of the population in terms of how a specific disease or condition is expressed in that population, are considered by the applicants. Okay, next slide. All right, and so then this is the last slide in this section, and it's just focused on addressing something that was brought up before, why we would request a full application in some instances. One of the most important is that a survey from Grants Working Group reviewers who have been doing positive selection and similar approaches indicates that the vast majority, 95%, use the full application in doing their assessments to make final selections. It ensures that eligibility can be fully determined and makes it unlikely that an eligible application takes up a valuable slot. We often run into issues with eligibility, and we don't want that element to be a factor in determining what ultimately advances. It ensures that selected projects are at the appropriate stage of readiness And this is particularly true for PDEV and CLIN2 in having their regulatory CMC and other product development elements in place. And also the time from submission to award is significantly shorter and mitigates project changes and staleness, as many reviewers refer to it, over time. So I will end this portion here, and if there are questions before we move on, please feel free.
Any questions or comments? Okay, let's continue.
Okay, so we're gonna go to the last step in the application lifecycle to walk the board through our proposal for how the guiding principles are incorporated into just providing a robust information package for the ARS in making their funding decisions. And so again, just to iterate, we're on that green part now, the funding decision for the ARS, and putting it in a red box to make it even more obvious. So as you know, historically, the CIRM team has provided recommendations to assist the application review subcommittee in making well-informed funding decisions. But ultimately, the ARS considers many different things in how it chooses to fund which applications. So there's gonna be the grants working group review summaries first and foremost. There may be programmatic factors, what's the program priority, budget of the overall program for that year, and so on. The recommendations from the CIRM team, that may be some specific funding recommendations for those applications in the pool. And lastly, the rich public comments that are unique to our funding agency. And so in the subsequent slides, I'll describe how these guiding principles are assessed and leveraged in the CIRM team recommendations. So what we're proposing to do is that in order to give a more robust information package, for every application that scores an 80 or higher by the grants working group, or that has a minority report, we will generate a guiding principles summary for the ARS. What this is going to do is distill some points of the application or the grants working group or the ANA specialist reviewer sentiment into those guiding principle categories. So for example, with transformative clinical impact, providing a succinct summary of the overall GWT sentiment on this topic. And then on the CIRM team side, providing a comparison to our active portfolio and the external landscape within that same indication. On the access and affordability point, again, to Pat's point, making sure this is really clarified. This is going to be a summary of the grants working group sentiment on this topic for that application. The summary of the ANA reviewer sentiment. So for CLIN2 applications, there is a specialist expert on access and affordability considerations who is providing a narrative and would incorporate the summary of their sentiment. And then our knowledge of any aspects of the approach that could be relevant. And then lastly, disease representation. So here the CIRM team will be preparing information about how this particular project or its indication would enrich the CIRM portfolio in terms of, is that disease indication represented? And overall, what's the proportion of that overall disease area? So for example, if it's a specific neurological disorder that's not represented in our portfolio, we would indicate that. And then we would also indicate our broader disease area of neuro disorders has X percentage of the overall active portfolio, which all may be important information that could be useful for the board to decide across the batch of applications that it's seeing how it may want to direct its funding decisions. On top of that, so for DIS 4, it's a similar sort of summary, but tailored to the guiding principles for that program. And then that would be one part of the overall package of information presented to the ARS. So in addition to the guiding principles summary, if the CIRM team has specific funding recommendations that are based on things like the available program budget, the grants working group score and comments, the guiding principles summary, the performance of the prior awardee, as well as new information available to CIRM after grants working group review, all of that will be summarized in a memo. So this is if the CIRM team has specific funding recommendations for the batch of applications to be considered by the ARS, we incorporate all this information into a narrative that will be provided to the board as a memo. So ultimately, the board would have to reiterate the guiding principle summary, the CIRM team recommendation, the grants working group summary, as well as any public comments that have been made for that batch of applications on hand to make funding decisions. This is an example of a memo that we provided to the board for a particular application cycle for a particular program. So it would provide structured information, including what's the available program budget, how much of it has been utilized in previous cycles in this fiscal year, what was the scoring breakdown for the applications, and what is the CIRM team recommendation. As well as what I noted previously, for any given application, we would provide a CIRM team recommendation for funding, as well as a guiding principles summary. So all this would be packaged into a memo that would help the board make its decision.
Pat's hand is raised.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have can you go back one slide?
Sure.
No, back again. There.
Yeah.
I don't know, tell me what you mean by bullet 5, new information available to CIRM after GWG review.
That's a great question. So that may be, so what we're doing here is we're compiling information that may be relevant to that application. So in that last bullet point, there may be some development in the field, or there may be some development, a new therapy has been approved. I'll give you an example of this that might make it a little bit more tangible. In the last PDEP round, there was an application that got funded where a lot of its plan was based on a therapy that was in phase 3 trials and how that might be incorporated into its clinical plan. And as after GWG review, but before ARS, there was a readout on that therapy that would be part of the treatment plan for this particular indication. And we would provide a summary of that information that could potentially help the board. So that may be one instance. Another one may be that this applicant has a current award and that there was some event that happened for an award that wasn't captured when the grants working group was reviewing it, and we provide that information as well.
Okay, well, we're already over. I'm not gonna, there's some issues there, some that we should discuss because the question is how the information is getting to the CIRM team. Is it validated? Is the reviewers on the GWG informed of this new information so they can weigh in? It should be a rare occurrence. And as you know, there are many funding agencies that don't take this into account because they want a level playing field. That is, so yeah, I'll stop there, but it's not clear to me yet how the kinds of ways it would be used and how one would verify the information.
Maria has her hand raised.
Maria?
Hi.
Maria.
I just wanted to ask Vito, I think at the board meeting, it's critical for you to think about and talk to the board about how the emphasis of the ARS might change and what changes perhaps in processes as well as our own method for how we take applications up in the orders, et cetera, because the running of the ARS is going to be different. And I think it's critical that the board and the ARS understand what's being asked of them at this point.
Mark, may I respond?
Please.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. We've already started conversations with relevant folks to gameplay this, if you will. It's I think the most obvious thing is with respect to how ARS takes up clinical applications for funding. We've usually considered them, accepted the recommendation of the team, and then voted on them one by one. But I could see implications for that, giving these report cards and templates where that may not be possible because the order of the applications might suggest that we would exhaust our budget before full consideration was given to all of them, and thereby defeating one of the principles of the revised review process. So there's more talk about that. I'm aware of what you said, and we started working on it already. Thank you.
I think it also plays into whether or not there are caps by individual rounds, which I know is something the team is looking at exploring and bringing to the board in June. So that will obviously also have an impact, because
Good point.
if it's the first review of the season after the budget, you could fundamentally fund all of them, and then you've exhausted your budget in one fell swoop. So all of these things really do have to be discussed. And there are a few ARS members on this call, so it's something for us to consider.
Great, thank you.
Great. Hey, I want to do a time check here. We're obviously 15 minutes over. I think just from a qualitative perspective, the team has done a huge amount of work and there's tremendous progress. Having said that, I think there are definitely some clarification points that merit further discussion and review. My personal preference would be to have a follow-on meeting to have that discussion prior to the full consideration from the board. But I wanted to do a time check here. I think there's a few more slides for review.
Sean?
Yeah, there's a couple more slides on the DIS4 program and on the PDEP program updates that we can go through if there's time.
Okay.
So we will likely lose a quorum in a few minutes, probably 12:30 at the latest. So that would leave 14 minutes to address them. But we're coming back regardless.
Yes.
Yeah. So we can tee this up and then have a discussion about all the points that the subcommittee would like us to address. So Pat, we've noted on this one as well. So there's a couple of other items that relate to the DIS4 program and the PDEP program, which will be incorporated into any concept plan amendments and keep those programs on track for the next funding cycle should the board approve these changes in March. So on the DIS4 side, as you previously noted and talked a little bit about, there's a focus area and this rotates. So one fiscal year, the focus area is set by the Neuro Task Force of the Science Subcommittee. And in the next fiscal year, the CIRM team makes a recommendation and the board sets the focus area. And so for the next fiscal year cycle for DISC4, the CIRM team is making a recommendation per this cadence for the board's consideration. And that is to make the focus area immune tissue interactions in disease and repair. So as we're all aware, the immune system is being more and more implicated in the pathology, repair, and regenerative mechanisms across multiple organ systems and human diseases. And so this is a timely topic where multidisciplinary approaches could really elucidate more understanding of that immune and organ system interaction and could also benefit from a network of awardees where sharing of data and methodologies and resources could provide insights across disease and organ systems. And so that's the nature of, that's the rationale for proposing this particular topic. And I think it's applicable to a broad range of diseases affecting Californians. And as I noted, it does allow for multidisciplinary and omics-driven approaches. So I will stop there for any comments that we can incorporate into the next meeting.
Maria?
I want to go back to asking my colleagues. I think for this program, I'm not opposed to it being a focused area and not allowing things outside of what you've asked for the immune tissue interactions and disease and repair, which I know so much about, by the way. But I'm not opposed to having that be the sole focus and not allow other indications or modalities to come in. So if that's something that my colleagues on the board are okay with, I think it strengthens this program and could be part of the concept plan. But I think we'd have to let the team know that and make a recommendation to the board to have that brought up or talk about it at the board meeting.
Thank you, Maria. Are there slides here, or was that the last slide?
So this is for the DIS 4 slide. It's only a slide for DIS 4. So if there are no comments, we can move on. You're good.
Yeah.
Great. And so this is the last topic, and I appreciate all the feedback so far. This is on the PDEV cycle recurrence. As the board is aware, the PDEV program currently specifies 2 application cycles per fiscal year. And in our analysis of the first 2 cycles, the expected benefits of those 2 cycles per year are not being either realized or not entirely relevant to this program. So some of the benefits of having multiple cycles per fiscal year include that the program is available when the project is ready. However, for the PDEV program, we allow entry at any point across the preclinical development lifecycle. So this may not be as relevant as in some other programs like CLIN2, where IND clearance and then being able to apply might make sense. An operational element is that the application, you would expect that if you had multiple cycles, resubmission would result in a reduced delay if you had multiple cycles. For the PDEV cycle, given the number of reviews that we do per year across CIRM and the length of the cycle, the cycles actually overlap for PDEV, and so it doesn't really allow someone to resubmit immediately for the next cycle. And lastly, if you have multiple cycles, you'll be able to batch the applications and awards over the fiscal year. However, as Maria noted before, because we don't have cycle caps, there's a high chance that the first fiscal year cycle will exhaust a large part of the program funds. That's what happened this year, where the first cycle had about $120 million of the $160 million deployed, leaving $40 million for the second cycle. And what we expect is that that's going to create a much higher demand for that first cycle of the fiscal year every year. So if we were to move to a single cycle per fiscal year, all applications would compete for the full program budget for that single cycle. There'd be a higher volume of applications that are reviewed to account for the full program budget. And then any unfunded applications would have to resubmit in the next fiscal year application cycle, which is roughly 6 months. And then lastly is that another implication is that if we have a single cycle per year, it allows us to better line up the program updates and the application lifecycle, so optimize it for that particular program. So those are the sort of implications for why we are recommending moving the PDEV program to 1 cycle per fiscal year. And I'll pause there, and that's the end of the presentation.
Okay, any questions for Shyam on the cycle? So I don't think we're ready to make a motion based on some of the questions and concerns. I think we need further qualifications and clarifications on some of the critical points that are brought up. But obviously would open that up to the Science Committee for discussion, comments by our team members or by the Science Committee on that.
I agree. I think that there's a lot of still outstanding questions that need to be answered. And so I would expect that I know a lot of people have been taking notes that this would be something that gets fully fleshed out and then comes to the board, full board in March. And if it can't be done by the full board in March, then it would really have to wait until June. So I would just encourage everyone to go back through the transcripts and the YouTube and make sure all the questions are addressed.
Yeah, because I think it's important to get things done by March because we have significant elements that need to get modified. And I think the CIRM team has done a marvelous job of coming up with a much, much stronger approach, not implying that the last approach was terrible. It's all a reflection of the fact that this is an entirely new process driven around the strategic allocation framework that is has the direct goal of getting greater leverage for the investments that are being made. And so the entire process of the allocation framework, the approval process, and working these things through, getting information from what we've learned with our first set of mechanisms is of great import and value. And now we just need to take the next step. But I think the time consideration is important. So I would advocate that we try to get something on the calendar and get it determined so that we can get an approval for the board meeting in March.
Mark, this is Scott over at HQ. I think what you're suggesting is that we continue this meeting to a future date, and for everyone's planning purposes, we will post that revision by tomorrow. But it's looking like this would be continued to March 19th at 2 p.m. So pencil that in, and you can use ink tomorrow.
Great, that sounds good, Scott. Any other comments by the CIRM team? And again, you're all to be commended because you guys have put in a massive amount of work over and above your already pressing day job. So much appreciated. But any comments?
So Mark, I would recommend that the CIRM team took copious notes. There's a transcript. If they want clarification on comments that were made in this meeting, I think they should be very aggressive about contacting the individual who made the comment and ask for clarification. If it's clear, it's clear. But I think to save time, right, get clarification up front. Contact the member of the subcommittee and say, can you clarify this? Because we didn't quite get it. And that'll help do the modifications. Okay.
Thanks, Pat.
Mark, I'll just
go ahead.
weigh in and respond. Thank you, Pat. And just thank you to everybody. This is a very complicated revision, as evidenced by the length of time that we've all spent together here today, and the amount of work that's gone into getting us to this point. And as with anything, there are always issues that come up that are very good issues requiring a bit more thinking to get to the finish line. And so we've had a number of those today. We hear you just as we heard you in the concerns raised in general, which resulted in this very different approach to the whole process. We will evaluate how best to integrate your comments into the final product. It'll come on the 19th with the goal of getting subcommittee approval to forward that to the full board. So thank you so much, everybody, for what you've done. Thanks again to the team for the Herculean effort here, and we really appreciate it. So thank you.
Great job, guys. Thanks everybody on the committee for the call, and look forward to taking next steps shortly.